Hello, everybody, and welcome to Positive Fandom. I'm your host, and tonight I am delighted to have Kamran Pasha here with us. Kamran, how are you?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be here. And the reason we're having this is because you and I had a very lovely dinner in the Los Angeles area just a few weeks ago. And you told me to watch this show. And I did. And I'm very glad you told me to do that because I have a lot to say about it.
Certainly, Cameron. And of course, for all of you out there who are watching right now, the show that we're talking about is a Netflix drama documentary called Rise of Empires, Season 1, Conquest of Constantinople. And you know something, Cameron? While it's true that this is a docudrama, meaning that the creators here did take some artistic license.
Mhm.
I've read a few comments that all focus on pretty much whether it's historically accurate, but I think might be missing the bigger picture here. The greatest significance to me is the excitement the creators had in making this production, because clearly it shows from every moment in the show how happy and how enjoyable this was for them as well. What do you think makes this production significant artistically?
Well, it is the first time that I'm familiar with that the story of the conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed the Conqueror by the Ottomans, transforming it into the name that we have today, Istanbul, has ever been shown. And there may have been some Hollywood movie from the 50s, like a El Cid type movie epic that I'm not familiar with, in which that was it. But I'm sure even any Hollywood effort to broach the subject in the past has always been from the Christian perspective, right? From the Byzantine perspective, and this is a series that is told very much from the Ottoman emperor's perspective and the Turkish perspective. And the director of the show, the showrunner of the show, is I believe a Turkish director who gathered together an incredible cast of primarily Turkish actors who are big stars in their home country, but aren't that familiar in the West. And I think a lot of them are going to become stars in the West. And we'll talk about some of them. I mean, this is some really remarkable talent. Production design is incredible, and it does something that a lot of docudramas, and that's what this is. This is a docudrama which has, you know sections which are acting, which are a production like a film, and sections which are commentary by scholars, historians, and it has the right balance of those elements. I think a lot of docudramas don't have the right balance, or one aspect of it is weak and one aspect is stronger. This is a very, very well done show across the board.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Cameron. And as you stated already, this series is a Turkish production. It's made in Turkey. It stars Turkish actors. The director, I believe his name is Emre Sahin.
Mhm.
He has a passion for this story that clearly changed history. Why hasn't this story not gotten the attention it should have production wise, when it's not only clearly culturally significant, but also excellent entertainment, Cameron? This series was just so enjoyable to watch.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, it's again for the reason that culturally it's from the other side, the other point of view than the European Western perspective. Here, the fall, as it's often called, the fall of Constantinople. That's how it's referred to in Western histories, right? When the Ottomans took Constantinople, which had been founded by Constantine the Great, who is really the one that legalized Christianity and made Christianity the official religion of the empire, and then founded this city that in his name that was founded, in the 300s and is still there today, right? And but these events, which take place in 1453, so about 1100 years after Constantine founded the city, which was essentially the center of Christian identity. I mean, I think we in the modern day think of at least Catholic identity being centralized in Rome, but remember, this was the religion of the Roman Empire. And when the Western Roman Empire fell very early on after the rise of Christianity, the Roman Empire fell in the 400s and 500s. And so essentially the continuing Roman legacy, imperial legacy, was the Byzantine legacy, which was based in Constantinople. They remained the Roman emperors. That's what they called themselves. They were the continuation of line from Constantine. And so when the Ottoman Turks, Muslims, conquer the city and take it and make it the capital of the Ottoman Empire and a predominantly Muslim city, from the point of view of the Christian West, that is a fall. That would be the same way the Muslims reacted to the conquest of Jerusalem by the Israelis in 1967, right? So that is seen by Muslims as the fall of Jerusalem. To Israelis, it is seen as this great historic moment. It's always a point of view, right? How you see it. And from the Muslim point of view, however, and the show goes into it, this was one of the greatest moments in Islamic history because it had been prophesized. And the show talks about this. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Islam, in his lifetime, he made a prophecy which seemed utterly impossible. He prophesied that the Muslims would take Constantinople, which at the time was, and for another 500 years after that, was the center of Christianity. Right? It was the symbol of Christianity in the way that the Vatican is a symbol of Catholicism today, but the Constantinople was a symbol of all Christianity at that time. And he prophesied in the 7th century that the Muslims would take that city and that it would become the home of Islam. And and he gave this very famous prophecy, which they talk about even in the very first episode of this show, where he said that the Muslims will take Constantinople, and that the king, the emir that would take the city, would be the greatest of all emirs, and the army that took the city would be the greatest of all armies in history. So you can imagine, once the prophet said that, every Muslim wanted to be the fulfillment of that prophecy. So shortly after his passing, within just a few years of the original Muslim conquests of the Middle East, they had pretty much conquered most of the Byzantine Empire within just a few years. They had conquered Syria, which was the center of Byzantine power, Palestine, they conquered Egypt. They took that all within about 4 or 5 years after the prophet's death. And so within just a couple of decades, the Muslim armies were at Constantinople because everyone wanted to be the fulfillment of that prophecy, and they failed. And they tried again and they failed, because, as it shows, that it's a brilliantly designed city that withstood for over 1,000 years because it had this most incredible walls that protected it, and this natural geography of being in the Bosphorus Strait. It was impossible to get to it. And 23 armies, not all of whom were Muslim, a lot of them were Christian armies. They don't really go into that in the show, but the Crusaders attacked Constantinople multiple times, because they wanted to seize it for themselves. And so it wasn't just Muslims trying to take Constantinople, other Christians were trying to take it. And so 23 armies tried and failed to take the city. And this is the show about the first army of any kind that conquered the city, and it was the Muslim army, and the fulfillment of that prophecy of Mehmed II, who is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and who was only 19 years old when he did it. 19 years old. I mean, I'm here visiting my sister, and I'm hanging out with my niece and nephew who are 19, 20 years old. It's hard for me to imagine that these kids could be leading an empire and outsmart 1,000-year-old strategy of defense, which what it shows that Mehmed came up with strategies no one else had come up with as this young kid who thought outside the box. And so that's why it has not been shown, because for Western culture, it is the downfall of an era of Christian dominance. And for Muslims, it is the fulfillment of prophecy, and it's a sacred moment. And so every culture sees it its own way. We are now at a moment in history where other stories are being told, and whether it's Hollywood hasn't really told the story. That's why they have a Turkish director show running this, and they have Turkish writers and actors. It's something Hollywood still is uncomfortable from my own experience, because I've written a lot of these Muslim epics of great moments of Islamic history that Hollywood's like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Even if there's a market for it, as this show proved. It's a very popular show on Netflix worldwide. There is a market for these stories, but Hollywood has its personal prejudices against them. So it's remarkable that Netflix pulled this off, and now is benefiting from this market that Hollywood wanted to pretend didn't exist.
Well, Cameron, I'm just so pleased that Netflix took a chance on this production. And as we have both said, it is a Turkish production, and Turkey is a hotspot for a lot of television. It's known for that. These Turkish stars were absolutely incredible. And the director and the production crew did a significant amount of research to bring this story to fruition. Was it necessary to also have the academics who appear in the production?
Well, I think it's necessary. Well, if the format is a docudrama, it's inevitable. But I think for people that don't know this story and don't know what they're buying into, I think it's very important, because it starts off with a voiceover. Narrator Charles Dance, who's a very famous actor and wonderful voice, narrates it, and so immediately you're being told, okay, I don't know anything about this. I don't know who Mehmet is. I don't know who are the Ottomans. I've never heard of them. What's this all? Why should I care? And they tell you why you should care, and that's what you start off with, these historians explaining. The show starts off with historians explaining what is Constantinople. It's perfect positioning in not just the ancient world, but the modern world, between Asia, Europe, Middle East, right, and Africa. These are all areas that the Roman Empire conquered through there, and then the Ottomans conquered, right, because it's the central point. And so people don't necessarily know that, and my own experience, I've written a lot of these historical epics set in the Muslim world. A lot of my time in these epics is having characters explain things, right? Because knowing the audience doesn't know them. And so this docudrama allows you to at least tell the story more efficiently in that way, in that you cut away from this great acting and action sequences to some, scholar at the Amherst University giving a dry but interesting explanation of this, and then you know what's going on, and it eases you into the story.
Absolutely, Cameron. And even with the academic presence, the production covers a lot of material.
Mhm.
For a major war campaign, it doesn't slight the gravity of the leaders, their soldiers, and the people living in Constantinople and the surrounding areas. And we used to see productions like this on TV, Cameron. Will we see more productions like this either on Netflix and perhaps come to other streaming networks?
Well, I mean, the very fact that the first one succeeded, the first one was produced, my understanding, just before the lockdowns happened in 2020, and then it was so successful because people were sitting at home watching it, like, what is this, And yeah, I believe it's part of a series of rise of empires, the Roman Empire, and so they said
Yes.
let's do one with the Ottomans, and so already the brand had fans in the same way, like Ancient Aliens is the brand that okay, I know what I'm getting, right? And so, Rise of Empires, I'm gonna get a story about an empire I don't know anything about. All right. Oh, Ottomans, I don't know, I'll watch it. And it was so successful that they commissioned a second season, which just premiered a few days ago, and I've watched, which we will get to next week, which is the incredible next part of the story. The first season is about Sultan Mehmed II and his incredible conquest of Constantinople, one of the most amazing events in military history, the most improbable events. And then second season is a much more personal battle between two men, and two men of incredible historical importance, even of the West, because it's Mehmed versus his old childhood friend, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, right? This is a historical conflict between these two
Yes.
men who were raised in the palace together, were friends, were like brothers, and then in the end are fighting to the death with each other for the future of Romania, which is an area the Ottomans are seeking to control. So that we'll get to that next week. But I think, to answer your question, the very fact that a second season was promoted, and I'm sure has done very well. I'd be surprised if it didn't. I mean, I was addicted to it. I couldn't stop watching. Then I think the success of that will at least have Netflix trying new things, and that will spread through Hollywood as people like, hey, maybe there is a market for this. Maybe what Cameron's been saying since 2002 might be true, that there is a market for these things, right? Maybe.
Certainly, Cameron. And, as we mentioned, this is a complete Turkish production with the actor speaking in English. It's probably dubbed in several languages. And I
Yes.
love that they decided to have a Turkish cast and crew here.
Mhm.
And I think it adds to the authenticity. At least for me, that's how I feel about it. But, Cameron, these events took place over 500 years ago. And yet this program doesn't feel like it's from that
No.
time period, outside from the weapons used in the costumes and everything like that. How did they make this story feel like it happened yesterday?
Well, part of it is language. They have. It's not these and thous. It's real people talking. In real ways. There's some bad language. There's some cursing. There's because they're in the middle of a war. People tend to curse in the middle of a war when terrible things are happening around them, and there's very and the dynamics, the machinations between the characters and the plotting is universal and eternal. And because if we went back in time, we would have to learn the customs and the language of these people. We wouldn't have to learn their humanity. We would understand their humanity. And that's what this show shows. You see the people wearing these elegant costumes, and there's all these courtly rules in both the Ottoman court and the Byzantine court. But at the end of the day, they're just people like us, right? And I think a movie that very effectively did that shook up Hollywood, and because they didn't want to give credit to the director for his own baggage, was Apocalypto, right? Apocalypto brought to life Aztec and Mayan culture in a way that no one had ever seen before. It made you feel like you were there because these are just normal people, living in the jungles of Mesoamerica, escaping human sacrifice, but they're just people. And the moments of you got these Mayan guys hanging out of the village making dumb jokes with their friends because they're just people, right? And then they're facing a horrific thing where they're being conquered by this very aggressive group of people who have a religious fanaticism that makes them believe that human sacrifice is part of their beliefs. And so that's tyranny. We all understand that, but it hurts more because it's just normal people who guy wants to hang out with his wife and son, right? He wants to hang out with his buddies. He's just out there farming. Everyone gets that because human beings don't change. And that's the success of this Ottoman series, is that it's just people, and the language and the behavior makes them feel contemporary because as human beings, they're universal. They are contemporary.
Yes, it certainly is incredibly relatable. And, it's, of course, we're not going to cover everything we want to cover in this, meeting today. But looking at the war aspect of this story, these two military fronts with strengths and weaknesses, they talk very much about the armor. We get to see a lot of the culture, not just through people together, but also through decoration. The strategy and role of politics here is complicated, and it's a mature story that holds you while whole thing is happening. You're really kind of like excited for what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
How would you describe what is happening outside of what we've been told in the classroom or that we know in general? Do you think that the story here is giving us a little bit something more of the passion behind what was to come in this story?
Well, one of the things that I knew, and I think in some ways Muslims are more aware because it's our cultural heritage, is that the Ottoman Empire was universal. They make the point of the show that Mehmed did not see himself as a Muslim conqueror, right? He saw himself literally. He took the title. He saw himself as the new Caesar. When he conquers Constantinople, the title he takes isn't Caliph of Islam, which actually his descendants will take that title. He doesn't take that. The title he takes is Caesar. He takes the title of Caesar. He's the new Caesar. And in the beginning, the opening scene when you meet Mehmed as a young man who is a prince who's been exiled from the palace because of internal politics, and he's grumbling about how he's lost his power and his father's got him under his thumb. The first thing he says, the first time you meet this young man, is he's frustrated that at his age, at 19, Alexander the Great had conquered half the world. And here he is sitting on this backwater of Anatolia in a village, not being able to fulfill his destiny, or so he imagines, right? The first thing he says is, I'm not fulfilling what Alexander did, right? So he's not thinking in terms of Islamic things. He's thinking in terms of a universal culture. And they show that in this show, which I think surprises a lot of people. First, that the Ottomans were so universal. Yes, they're Muslims. There's no denying that they're proudly Muslim, right? But the court itself was incredibly diverse. The character, and I want to spend some time talking about it. The character that's, to me, is the most fascinating is the character of Mehmed's stepmother, who is the sort of power behind the throne, the woman that raised him as her son. He's not her biological son. He is the son of another woman in the previous sultan's harem, but she was the sort of favorite consort of his father. And when the father dies, she becomes his primary advisor. And she's played by this absolutely incredible Turkish actress, Tuba Büyüküstün, right, who is one of their top actresses in Turkey. She's considered. I looked her up because I didn't know her. I was like, this woman's incredible, and she's literally she's like their Meryl Streep. She's
Yes.
older. She's about 40, and but incredibly elegant, incredibly beautiful, and very ruthless, and plays this role. But what's important is that she is Christian. She's Serbian Christian, and throughout the thing, she's wearing a cross. She's not Muslim. She didn't convert to Islam, right? And in the army, the pivotal people that help him conquer Constantinople are Christians. The guy who builds the biggest cannons the world had ever seen, which are used in the pilot episode, which Mehmed had developed. If cannon work, gunpowder had only been in use in the West for a couple of decades before. Obviously, in the East, in China and whatever, it had already been in use, but it hadn't gotten to this part of the world, and only until recently. And suddenly, Mehmed is coming up with essentially the Death Star. He's coming up with the biggest cannons anyone's ever seen, and who built those cannons are Hungarian Christians, right? And they have this scene where Hungarian Christians, he's like, you're the lawful leader of these lands. Because he asked him, why aren't you working with the Christians? Why aren't you selling why aren't you selling your huge cannon to the Byzantine emperor? And number one, the Byzantine emperor can't pay him because it's very expensive. But number two is he's like, you're the lawful leader of these lands because Mehmed has held himself up to be the new Caesar that will unite humanity, right? And so that is something that I think will surprise the audiences because you root for him because he isn't provincial. He is very much, what we would imagine to be a modern man, a sort of a modern, bringing all nations together kind of person. And so you kind of side with that, as a viewer, unless you're very like, well, he attacked a Christian land, then you can see him as the adversary. But His army was filled with Christians. His court was filled with Christians. So is this really a Christian versus Muslim conflict? I don't think so. And the show makes that clear.
Yeah, and that's very good to point out, and I'm glad that you did. And as we both discussed, so many armies have tried to conquer Constantinople and failed. And, honestly, it seems as if Mehmed had envisioned something greater
Mhm.
for Constantinople under his rule.
Yeah.
What was his vision, do you think?
Well, his vision was exactly what he said. He wanted to reestablish the Roman Empire, but going the other way. The Romans had started in the west and went east. Alexander started in the west and went east. He's coming from the east and going west. And they mentioned it in the show that the Ottoman Empire began. The Ottomans were essentially nomadic tribes, not different from the Huns or the Mongols. They weren't an organized society. That happened over time. They were essentially raiders. They were just, like the Tusken Raiders of Star Wars, right? They were different clans. And there was one clansman who was his great great grandfather named Osman, who's the Ottoman Empire's name, Osman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that's how it's pronounced in the West. But Osman had a dream, and he talked about it. He had a dream of one day, his lands would stretch across all of Europe. He saw this beautiful tree that connected all of Europe and Asia. And so this tribal nomad had this vision that his progeny would unite the world. And so here is Mehmed, his descendant, fulfilling that vision. And to him, the Byzantines have failed the glory of Constantinople. All they've got is the city. The Byzantine Empire by 1453 is just the city of Constantinople. It's lost everything. Mehmed actually surrounds it. The Ottoman Empire already extends well past Constantinople into Bulgaria, into the edge of Romania. So this Constantinople is this tiny island surrounded by the Ottomans on all sides for over 100 years. And it's just survived as this tiny island because of its incredible walls. And so to Mehmed, this is, the humiliation of Constantinople, that this great city of the Romans is essentially this walled off enclave that's under constant siege, that has lost its glory. And by taking Constantinople, he's trying to restore it to the grandness of the Roman vision, right? In his mind, he's not trying to humiliate and to destroy these people. In fact, they make a very important point in the first episode where, and they point out, it comes from Islamic law. In a military situation, before you get into a conflict, you send emissaries. It's under the Quran. You send emissaries to your adversary to negotiate some solution so you don't have to fight. And he did that. He sent so and he gave the Byzantine emperor, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine was his name, ironically, Constantine 11. He sends these emissaries and said, look, we have 80,000 soldier army. You've not seen anything like that at your gates. And we're going to take the city. We don't want to kill anybody. We don't want chaos, right? Here's the deal. Surrender the city. All your people will be safe. There will be no looting. No one's churches are going to be destroyed. We're just going to have a transition of power. I'm the emperor. You step down. We're done. There will be no death. And Constantine's like, no, I'm the 57th Roman emperor, going back to my ancestor was Augustus, and I will not step down. It turns out to be a mistake, because he does win and he doesn't loot and destroy the city, but a lot of people die in this battle, right? And Constantine should have taken the offer, because the end result is the same, except all these people that died because of this battle when Mehmed was going to win. And so, that scene is very important because Mehmed, that showed a sense of honor. He knew or at least he believed he could pull this off, and he was offering them a way out that they should have taken, but they were a little too confident in those walls.
This is such a good point, and it is something to think about. As a leader, that responsibility that you have when you engage, it's not just you, it's everybody who you are leading, and it can have such an effect over everyone. And in this story, from the beginning, they described Constantinople almost as a jewel among jewels.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Hagia Sophia is located within Constantinople.
Yes, I've been there. It's incredible.
Yes, it's still standing. And in the story, it's described as the largest building in Europe.
Yes.
Kamran, what wonders were contained in the city, and why was conquering it considered getting the red apple?
Sure. Well, again, for Muslims, it goes back to the prophecy, right? The prophet himself, and the prophet, by Muslims make no apologies for it. The prophet was a military leader as well as a sacred leader, right? And he viewed the rise of Islam as removing these failed and oppressive cultures around him, like the Sasanian empires of the Persians and the Byzantines, who were oppressing their own people. The Byzantines were crushing other Christians. Right. The reason that the Muslims were able to conquer the Byzantine areas of Egypt and Syria and Palestine was because the local Christians rose up in support of them. Because the Byzantine Church did not permit any form of heresy, right? We're not even at the Protestant Revolution yet, right? We're talking about 7th century, and any church that went against the official Byzantine narrative was heretical and was crushed. And so you have all these, you had all these different Christian groups in the Byzantine Empire that were being oppressed, didn't have freedom of religion from their own Christian emperor. And so when the Muslims showed up, they're like, "Sounds good. You're just going to give us all the same treatment? We're good. Okay, we'll support that." And that the Byzantine Empire was oppressing its people. The Sasanians were oppressing their people, and they fell rapidly because they didn't have their people's support, right? And so the Prophet saw Constantinople both from from a purely military standpoint, because the conquest of Constantinople, because Islam is proclaiming itself to be the final revelation from God, and so the conquest of the previous revelation center site, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, would be the historic proof of that. So from that point of view, the Prophet is establishing this, right? But it's just not the Prophet of Islam. Everyone wanted Constantinople. As I said, the Crusaders ransacked it. They weren't able to breach the walls. Crusaders got in because everyone's like, "Oh, Crusaders are coming us to help us fight these evil Muslims. Let's bring them into the city." And then they ransacked the city and they took all the stuff and went back home. They didn't go to Palestine. They're like, "Oh, you let us in? It was the Trojan horse. You let us in? We were never going to Palestine. We're just going to take your city," right? So the Crusaders ransacked it. So everyone wanted this because it was the ultimate metropolis. When you have the largest building on the face of the earth, that speaks for itself. That represents the highest civilization that human beings have achieved at this era, right? So anyone that controls that has the pride of that, right? And I've been to the Hagia Sophia, which was created by Justinian in the 400s, and it was built and as a basilica, and was the largest church until modern times in the world. And it was the largest building until really modern times. And I've been there twice. One time I went there with actually an academic scholar who was Eastern Europe. I think he was a Romanian scholar who took us on a special tour of the site. And he showed us the original stone, the markings on the ground of the Hagia Sophia. The actual, they're like, you'd walk on it, not even notice it. There's these stone marks. He's like, "Do you know what those are? Those are the original stone marks by the architects in 400 AD when they were chiseling, when they were figuring out how the dome was going to work. They created these marks as position points. It's like, that's the original mark that's carved into the ground by the original architect, right? It's there, and you're just walking on it. No one even realizes it, right? And it's absolutely stunning. Now, here's a fascinating thing about the Hagia Sophia, which you can visit today, is that again, when so it was a church for 1100 years. When Mehmet took it, and this surprised me because people say, "Oh, you guys stole the church." No, Mehmet actually bought the church. This is not shown in the show, but this is something that is very much Islamic law. And so when Mehmet entered the city, he was going to take this site as the central site of the city, but he went to the patriarch who is now defeated. I mean, their empire was gone and their emperor protector was gone. He said, "This is a deal. We'll buy it from you. We're not gonna, we're gonna pay you a lot of money, and we're gonna buy it from you. We're gonna buy the land and the church and the Hagia Sophia," and he did. And so the Orthodox patriarchate sold the church to Mehmet, who then turned it into a mosque. Right. Same things was done in Spain when the Muslims conquered parts of Spain. There were churches there. They would purchase the churches. They wouldn't conquer them and say, "Get out." They're like, "Okay, we're going to buy this from you, a legal transaction. Give us the deed, and then we're going to turn it into a mosque. We're not actually going to steal this from you," right? So he did that. He turned it into a church. Turned it into a mosque, and it remained a mosque until the Ataturk created the modern Turkish Republic, which was made a museum. But what's fascinating is, so when it was made a museum, so the original, the church was very famous for having these incredible mosaics all over, these stunning Byzantine mosaics that were all over. There was actually a brief period where those mosaics have been damaged because Christians went through what is called the iconoclastic period, where 7th to 9th centuries, they thought images were, people say that about Muslims, you think images are idol worship, like the Taliban blowing up those statues of the Buddhas, right? So the Christians started destroying their own, their own relics. So, but many of them were preserved in the Hagia Sophia, and the Muslims didn't destroy them. They simply covered them up with wood. and saying we're not going to destroy the religious symbols of this other religion. But we cannot pray with iconography in the mosque, so we covered it up. And so when it became a museum in the 1920s, they simply took the wood down, and it had preserved all of these incredible, I've seen them, these incredible mosaics that are now there, that from the original building, that were simply preserved. They weren't destroyed, right? And so now it is there. I think the current government, which likes to present itself as religious, has been trying to turn the site back into a mosque. And again, that's not out of religiosity. That's a nice little PR thing, because governments love to stir up people's religious sentiments, right? But it is an incredible site that is still very much open to everyone, and people should go see it, because it really it humbles you when you walk in there. Today, it humbles you. You look up at this, you feel like so small in this building. You can't even imagine what Mehmed felt and they show that, and then when he just walked in by himself, fulfilling the prophet's prophecy that this would happen, and he's the guy that does it, right? And he walks in there, and it's just overwhelming.
Well, Kamran, a lot of what happens, especially the scene that you just described, is incredibly satisfying as you're watching the show. And we do learn a great deal about Mehmed as a child, as his first time as a ruler. There's a lot of mysticism in the program specifically about the Sultan. And, it's no doubt he's an incredible historical figure. But they make it very clear in the series that the action is won by technical expertise and thinking outside of the box. And it's clear that Mehmed has this. What else can you tell us about him that wasn't revealed in this production that we should be aware of?
Well, I think they only hinted at his mysticism, and in the second season they talk a little more about it, because the second season they mentioned the Sufis. I'm a Sufi mystic, right? In the mystics of Islam, they mentioned the Sufis by name in the second season, and the Sufis are warning him of his dreams. So he was very much the lineage of the Ottomans. They were, remember, they come out of a shamanistic tribal culture, very similar to the Mongols, right? They were essentially ethnically related to the Mongols, and had moved from that area step by step, eventually into Turkey, as nomads. And so they still had this shamanistic culture, of which Sufism very quickly became an expression of, right? And so they had the sense of dreams and portents and visions, and Mehmed was very much driven by that. He had this sense that he was the chosen one, right? And he had this from childhood. And that's why he's very frustrated, because as the show shows, he was initially given the Sultanate. His father decided to retire under mysterious circumstances. His father was still alive, and basically said at the age of 13, I believe it was 12 or 13, Mehmed, you're the new Sultan. And young kid wasn't quite ready for that, right? And then it was taken away from his father returned. So 6 years later, Mehmed comes back when his father dies. But he always had the sense that he had this destiny, and that's hinted at in the show. There's a moment where he talks to one of the advisors, the vizier, who's sort of the evil villain. Always it's historically true. The vizier opposed him in his efforts to conquer Constantinople. He plays a little bit of the archetypal, Jafar in the in the Aladdin thing, right? The evil vizier, right? It's a bit of an archetype, because there's historical truth to it. But there's this moment where he decides to co-opt the vizier, who's figured out is actually double dealing on behalf of the Romans. But instead of executing the guy for treason, he decides, you know what, let's turn this around. Let's make this guy feel secure. And he calls him in and shares with him his dream of how this dream that came to him. And it's not clear whether that dream was real or not. I'm sure Mehmed had actual visions and dreams like that guided him to fulfill that. And the one thing that they do a little bit of, and it's through there's a very excellent Turkish actor who plays the vizier, his stepmother, and that culminates in a very surprising way, how his stepmother really feeds into that. And she's very much into astrology, and and she convinces him, when he's about to give up the conquest after several weeks of siege, that are, even with all of his brilliant strategies, it's just not working, right? And he's about to give up, and his stepmother essentially rides out from Serbia to let him know that the astrologers have predicted that this is his day. If he acts today, he will win. If he doesn't, he will lose it forever. And and again, feeds into the mysticism of these people. He believes that, and he acts on it, and he does win. So certainly, as you may know, I'm working on my own project set in the Ottoman Empire, and mysticism is very, very central to it. Probably a little bit more than it was in this show.
Certainly, Kamran. And, it certainly is very interesting to see all of the action that we do see in this. And I should be very clear, although I didn't actually say it from the beginning, that there are an incredible amount of fighting scenes in this series, more than I've actually seen in a lot of series They spend a lot of time, Cameron, being very specific and very careful in portraying things a certain way. You mentioned the cannon, that enormous cannon. I think it was called
Basilica.
Basilica.
Yeah, yeah.
Basilica. And it truly was a character in itself in this
Mhm.
story, Cameron,
It's like
because
the Death Star is. It has its own function. It has its own soul, really.
it really was like the Death Star, except this is 100% real. Cameron, I think that was one of the things that fascinated me the most. I'm not usually, so fascinated by weapons, but this thing, you couldn't ignore it, Cameron.
Yeah. You
It
couldn't ignore it today. If you saw a gun like
no,
that,
no, you
you'd
couldn't.
step back. You wouldn't get in the way of that gun. That's 500 years ago.
And I think that what I do like about shows like this is that by demonstrating the technology that we see in a show like this, we know what was possible even over 500 years ago. You very rarely see war movies that don't have cannons or some kind of something similar to Basilica. But was this one of the first uses on the battlefield of something of this size, Cameron? I'm not expecting, and
No,
I know.
they actually say that there was nothing like this. There were small cannons, there were hand cannons, they were the kind of cannons that we kind of imagine on pirate ships, right? This was something that was 40, 50 feet long, that had a cannonball that was, you know, 6 feet wide, 6 feet circumference, and fired over a mile distance. I mean, that's impressive today in 23, a weapon of that nature, right? And that was a first. They had never had anything like that. They went from basic, hand weapons and gunpowder to this kind of thing essentially overnight. And that was something that really Mehmed did. He was the master of doing things literally overnight. They show in the pilot episode that when Mehmed becomes sultan, the Byzantines basically threatened to release his uncle who's been held prisoner inside of Constantinople. And his uncle's sort of like, rich playboy buffoon who's not ready for the throne. But the idea is they release his uncle. The uncle's got a claim on the throne. Some Ottomans will support him. There'll be a civil war. And so they thought that's going to scare off Mehmed from messing with them. We got your uncle, and he could set us up. What's Mehmed's response? He builds a tower blocking off all shipping lanes to Constantinople. He builds it in 4 months, a tower that is standing today. I mean, you go to Constantinople, you go to Istanbul today, you will see this stunning, huge, like 100-foot tower that's standing today that he built in 4 months to tell the Byzantines, I'm coming. You want to mess with me? There's no messing with me. I'm coming. And I've just done the impossible thing. I've just blocked off your sea lanes. You didn't see that coming, did you? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of great sex stuff here. Lovely ladies, some sensuality, and it's quite lovely.
Well, something, Cameron, and many times that you and I have streamed together, and I've told you that I always felt that there should be more romance, more sex and sexuality, adult content in a lot of these stories, because a lot of times it was a huge part of the story. And they certainly didn't shy away from it in this series. And they didn't have to do this, Cameron. They didn't have to add in these extra parts and layers that made this production so impressive.
But I want to comment on that. On that because
yes.
it makes it more interesting to watch, right? Just a bunch of guys swinging swords at each other loses its interesting without the feminine energy, right? But let's also be honest. Let's go back to the Iliad, right? War from a male's perspective is about women. Not how women see it, because they see themselves as the victims of the war, right? But for men, conquest is, on a very crass, lowest level, it's access, conquer a new nation, and access to the beautiful women of that nation so you can reproduce with them, right? That's on the very lowest level of that kind of thinking. But it's something you saw Helen of Troy. That's the reason the story is there. It's archetypal. Without the women of this, and let's be honest, this is a Xena warrior princess. You don't have female warriors running around and fighting, although you'd be surprised there were female warriors in these environments, but the story doesn't focus on them because it's not the norm of this kind of situation. But what the women are doing is they're both nurturing and healing. Like you have this scene here, which is the characters in this scene are Justiniani, who is this who was Mehmed's nemesis, who was the Genoese Italian mercenary who defended Constantinople and was quite brilliant himself and made Mehmed's life difficult, right? Mehmed kept being outsmarted by this guy, right? And that forced Mehmed to get better. But this story, and I'm not sure it's historical, but there is this love romance with the daughter of a Byzantine nobleman that we see here. They've made love, and she's sort of the person that gives him something to fight for, not just the money and the fame, the glory. And similarly, in the first season, we don't see much of Mehmet's personal life. We don't meet his wife and his son until the second season, right? But
Yes.
his relationship with his stepmother, who is essentially, the power behind the throne. Without her, he doesn't have the self-confidence and the ability to pull all the way through. And any man who is honest will admit that women at their best build us up to be the greatest men that we can be. And that is what the show shows, right? The worst, they destroy us. And a little bit of, without revealing the secrets of the plan, Justiniani's, ultimately we know, obviously Justiniani did not succeed because Mehmed did conquer Constantinople, so his defense did not work. But part of this is that they show it, he develops feelings for this woman. And so is his attention in risking his life and risking her life and taking the city, or is his intention in protecting her? And when the intention changes, his strategy changes, and that has an impact on world history.
It certainly is impressive to see what goes on, and often I'm saying, not just to you, but to many of us who comment here in this community on YouTube, how important it is to see these relationships between men and women, these intimate relationships that happen and are important and often are the driving point of a story, can be the new motivation, as you mentioned, Kamran, but also can change the story. It makes the story go forward in a different way, in a natural way, because it is natural for these attractions to happen. In fact, one of the first scenes we see of this incredible strateger is that he notices her. She's tending to people who are wounded in Constantinople. And he says, "Oh, this girl's nice. Oh, wait a minute. She's not an ordinary peasant girl. She's a noble lady." And it fascinates him even more that she would even have anything to do with just ordinary people, ordinary soldiers. And she says, "Well, these are my people. I have to make sure that they survive." And he realizes, I think he also realizes that would mean that she might accept someone like him. But even more important, it puts her in path to even meet him, because she probably wouldn't even be talking to this man, in a normal situation. So I think it is very interesting to show that people do have these moments where they have these encounters. Maybe she was looking for someone too. It was uncertain times, Kamran, uncertain times in the city of Constantinople.
Yeah, and passions rise. Casablanca is all about that, right? Passions rise at moments of life and death, and there's nothing more moments of life and death when your city is surrounded by an apparently invincible army, right? There's nothing more life and death than that. And so, yeah, without the women, the show wouldn't work. And there's other characters. There's this woman who is a spy that's shuttling between a Greek nobleman and the Ottomans. And her background is interesting because she herself is Turkish, had been a Turkish Muslim girl who had been captured by the Byzantines. Her parents had been killed, and she was raised an orphanage. So now she's Christian. And so where are her loyalties, right? She's Turkish. She remembers being a Muslim as a child, but now she's a committed Christian, and she's being a spy between the two. Where are her loyalties? She's one of the most fascinating characters. I don't know that she is historical, but she plays a very pivotal role in the events that happen. And I think she symbolically represents real people that did exist and had the scenario that she was in.
Well, this is, as we've said, there are so many layers to this fantastic series. There is a focus on the two fronts with the Sultan's army that shows them being incredibly well equipped, well armored. They're wearing chainmail. There are quick moving, specialized units. They all have different names. I think there's the Janissar. I know I'm pronouncing that.
The Janissaries are essentially their special forces. Yes.
Yes. And also Constantinople defenders who wear, as they told you, much thicker armor, broadswords, big shields, crossbows. And they also have several special fighting groups. I think they're called the Condottiere. But despite this, obviously Constantinople, the groups that were defending them didn't win the battle. I kind of feel like this is a question I should have asked you prior to this, but I was kind of curious as the fact that being a mercenary, being paid, and not fighting for a principle, does it make a difference in the battle over a city that is so strongly associated with religion?
Well, and it did make a difference here historically. We saw that without revealing how the final moments of the defeat of the Byzantines, that plays a role. The emperor, and he's a tragic figure. This final emperor that he had a prophecy too, that he might be the one that brings it all down, and he doesn't want to be the fulfillment of that prophecy. and he does end up fulfilling that prophecy. But he goes, the Constantine the 11th. He goes, he knows it's over when it is over. He knows it's over, and he says, "Well, I'm going to go down with the ship like a captain, right? I'm not surrendering, and I'm going to sacrifice my life." Others, not motivated by personal identity, by religion, by destiny sense, all that, they don't stick around, and that changes the direction of the battle. Had they stuck around, it probably would have made it harder for Mehmed. And so that's the challenge when you're working with people that have been paid and aren't ideologically committed to your cause.
It's very interesting. And, of course, this is a cause that absolutely every little bit would count. We already knew that, they were low on funds. They were completely broke.
Yes.
The only thing they had was Constantinople. So, pretty much they're fighting for the last thing that they were holding on to. And I think maybe that was also another reason why he didn't just walk away. Although Cameron, he could have taken, and been wealthier than he ever had been, honestly.
Yeah, and that is a point they make. Justiniani is offered. There's actually an incredible moment where the Sultan and Justiniani meet, right, under
Yes.
flag of truce, and Justiniani says, "Well, I could just kill you right here, right?" And it's over. But he's not going to, because they honor the flag of truce, right? That's why the Sultan just laughs in his face, because he knows he's not going to do anything. He knows that yes, you could just kill me, but to these people, honor matters. Even to a mercenary, honor matters. Because even if the sense of reputation is like, who's going to hire him if he's a loose cannon that will not honor the flag of truce? Because you can't, in any military situation, you have to have back channels. You have to have a means of resolving it in a way that minimizes the suffering of your own people. And so that's why any civilized society, even in horrific war, has the white flag. Otherwise, you can't resolve anything. And once you violate that, then you're down to barbarism, and there's no trust left. And so that's why the Sultan just laughs in his face. He's like, "You're going to kill me? You're not going to kill me. I have a white flag, right? You do that, it will be at that point, even your Christian soldiers won't trust you, right?" And
Well,
so,
I think it was said for the viewer, like me, who does not know that. And, I say, okay, next time I see a white flag, I'll know that's the reason why. I always knew that I always thought it meant that you were surrendering, but maybe not.
Well, I mean, it can mean that, but it also, in this context, it means, I'm coming as a messenger in the middle of a conflict, and I have the amnesty that comes with that.
Okay.
Otherwise, there's no way to communicate. That's why the president and the president of Russia have a red phone, right? You have to have these lines of communication, or everyone dies.
Well, Cameron, perhaps one of the most impressive feats in this action is held in the episode Into the Golden Horn. This unbelievable execution involved moving 70 ships across a heavily wooded forest
across the woods, moving ships across land without any water to break into the one way they have to get into the Bosphorus on the other side.
It is incredible, Cameron. It's absolutely spectacular, completely unbelievable.
That's what no one imagined doing it. No one could have imagined that. Everyone thought because to explain to the viewer. So the way Constantinople is set up, it's essentially divided between the Bosphorus Strait. One side is to Europe and one side is Asia, right? And within that, it's almost like the European side is almost like a peninsula, right? So there's a curve in the water that's called the Golden Horn, where the water curves in and it ends in this sort of wooded area, the heavily wooded area. And if anyone could, that's the back way into the Bosphorus, and then controlling the shipping lanes, and then the city is surrounded. There's no way to go. But there was the natural defense of a mountainous forest at the end of that waterway. So there was no way to get to it. And so no one ever even imagined it. And Mehmed is trying desperately to find a way around the blockade that is set there, that Genoese ships have been able to set up, that prevents him from taking the city by water. And then he comes up with probably the greatest tactical idea in human history. He comes up single-handed, his 19-year-old kid says, if we can't get the ships there by the water, what if we can get there by land? And that's insane. How are you going to do that? It's like, we're going to carry these ships through the woods to the other side. They're not going to see it coming. How would they imagine that you're carrying 70 ships through the woods and then landing them in the back way and no one's seeing you, right? And so that was why the prophet said it will be the greatest Amir, because this guy came up with something that no military strategist had ever considered in history before that. He had no roadmap to try that. Alexander hadn't done something like that, to my knowledge. He was looking, I'm going to try this. I mean, and he pulled it off.
It was spectacular, Kamran, and of course there are many details to how and why it was executed. They really needed to get their ships into this area. There was this chain that was blocking the path, a chain going across the harbor.
Yeah.
I didn't know they had chains back then to do that. I've heard of that more recent, but it sounds incredibly fascinating. And what they decided to do was go around it. And it's not easy to do that now, but you know, the idea of having to do it and in secrecy with no one hearing you, they managed to work out how to do it. I'm not going to say how it was done, but guys, when you watch the series, if you already know historically how it was done, it's just so incredible. But we also saw, Kamran, that there were sappers and, in other words, miners who were undermining the walls as well in the foundation of the city. And gee, Kamran, there's so many instances of things that happen that you witness in this series. And I keep thinking they've got to make a movie about that. They've got to make a movie about that. They've got to make a, you know, I think that if we go ahead and even look at just a fraction of what they decided to show in this program, we would keep discovering more and more. But was having, you know, these sappers and perhaps that man who could detect when someone was mining under the walls.
Yeah, so that's the brilliant. The great thing about the show is that the Greeks aren't idiots. They have a counter to everything Mehmet's coming up with. They know someone's going to try to go under the walls, so they come up with ingenious ways to figure out where those miners might be, like using seismic things and water to detect the tremors. Where are those miners so that we can then hit them from above, you know, before they undermine the walls, right? The only thing they had no defense against was his gambit around the water, because no one had imagined it. But everything else, there was like, okay, if I were them, I'd try to get under the walls. How do we stop that? They were quite smart.
Another thing that I noticed about this program is that they did actually let us see, you know, it wasn't sort of just like this was the fight where they won and that was it. We're there. It's almost as if we're there for the entire campaign. And I know it doesn't represent every day, but Kamran, they sure had a lot of details about so many significant events in this campaign. You know, I was absolutely, you know, thrilled that we got to see the wins and losses on both sides. But
and you never knew who was going to come out. Yes, you sort of were. Yes, ultimately Mehmet obviously won because it's now called Istanbul and not Constantinople. But you're like, at the end of every episode, you're like, how are they going to get out of this?
Yes.
And each time it flips, I was like, oh, how are the Greeks going to get out of this? Oh, how are the Turks going to get out of this? Because like each time it flips as to who's winning the battle.
Yeah, it really was amazing to see that. And it was a little bit heartbreaking to see, you know, Constantine constantly hoping that there would be forces sent from Rome, you know, only to find out, let's say at the end, that a week or two later, those forces did show up.
Yeah, but by which time the Ottoman flag is flying over the city, so there's no point anymore, right? What are they going to attack, right? And so, you know, but again, part of it was also that they didn't show all of this. They hinted at it. You know, there's a reason those things were delayed. If the Christians weren't busy killing each other, they would have been united against this. The hatred between the Catholic Christians versus the Orthodox Christians was so deep and was several centuries old by then that there was, you know, there were people probably on both sides. In fact, one of the characters even says it. One of the Greek characters says, I'd rather see an Ottoman turban inside these walls than the pontiff's cap, right? I don't want to see a pope in here. And so I'm sure one of the reasons that the Genoese and others delayed was that they're like, well, is it such a bad idea for these dumb Orthodox to be defeated and then Catholicism is the true Christian faith? Is that so bad, right? And so I'm sure there was that hesitation. And then there was also economic concerns. The Genoese are traders. They're making money. Like, do they really want to turn against this rising power and cut off business? It almost feels like they've kind of let this happen.
There certainly were other politics going on internally as well, and they demonstrated that, you know, perfectly. And we did talk about prophecies, and I think it's very interesting, Kamran, that there were two very specific things that happened in the story. And we
Mhm.
did mention Mother Mara,
And let's
her
bring her up
role.
because she's so lovely. You had some beautiful images of her because I would love to cast her in my own show. There's a specific role that I think she would be absolutely brilliant for. I was unfamiliar with this actress, and now I'm looking her up, and she's literally their Meryl Streep. She's the number one actress in Turkey, and I'm amazed they got her for the show.
Well, they described her. The academics described her as Slavic, Greek, Ottoman, and Western, all rolled up into one.
Yes.
It was almost like she was like Constantinople herself, or the heart of Constantinople. And I got a sense that they were trying to tell us that there were a lot of people like this. Maybe that was the majority of the city, even though Constantine wanted it to kind of focus on, perhaps his heritage. That was important.
Sure, he wanted his lineage, but again, she's very proudly Christian, and yet she's the one that machinates on Mehmed's behalf. I mean, a good portion of the show cuts to her in her father's palace in Serbia, where she's essentially on her own behest serving as a spy for Mehmed. You know, her father senses he's not sure where his daughter's loyalty lies, right? And he's kind of nervous about her. Overhearing conversations he's having with other Christians about potentially attacking Mehmed, and we can tell where her loyalties lie. And without it really is clear, at least the way the show presented. And I've just recently got a wonderful book called 1453, which details the history of this battle, of this specifically. I want to read in that book how historically documented her role is. I have a feeling it's probably pretty accurate that she went back and told Mehmed, "This is your moment." The astrologers have predicted it when he's literally about to quit. He's like, I can't outsmart this just any other guy. Everything I do, even my gambit with the ships hasn't worked. It's brilliant, but it didn't get me the apple, right? So maybe I'm just failing. And then she comes in without her telling him it is your destiny and it is prophesized and the stars are in your moment. He wouldn't have done it, right? I want to bring up more of Tupac Tucson. Let's bring up. Bring it up. I need
And
my
so,
Tucson.
I think it is also very interesting showing the role that she had and how important she was.
Yes.
She, essentially what they're saying is that if she had not intervened, let's say perhaps it's not one, I'm not going to say it's 50-50, but perhaps if she had not intervened, the win may not have taken place, Cameron. The levity of her role here is remarkable because it didn't just start at that moment, Cameron. She took over as a surrogate mother for him when he was, let's say, taken from his mother and brought to his father, who was the Sultan at the time. He was very, very young. He was just practically a child. She raised him as her own. And, she became a mother to him.
Yeah.
And, I kind of think, what's interesting about this is just seeing the role of this woman who had such an influence over him. And it was a wonderful influence. It was wonderful for her as well. She said that she thought about him as if this was her son.
Yeah.
And I like the freedom. I'm going to say it. I like the freedom that she seemed to have, Cameron, to go different places and do what she liked. Serve as this very important political strategist, asking her father questions about whether he's going to go ahead and attack Mehmed's army, and that he probably shouldn't be thinking that. Like it was very, very, it was fun to see the passion she had with this, but also she was very much in charge of her own destiny, even though she was asked to go, to Bosnia or Serbia, on the request of Mehmed. She clearly was in control because she could go wherever she wanted to. Cameron, is our opinion of what women could do, like in regards to travel at this time period, was this typical for women? Because we do see women moving around. There was the young lady who went in and out of the city. There is a certain level of freedom here.
Well, I mean, again, we project a lot of things both in the historical past and onto the Muslim world in general about women. And so one of the things that I think is the defining thing that made life in the Muslim world in general, the Ottoman Empire in particular, different for women was something that didn't exist in Europe. Women in the Ottoman Empire could own property, right? And so under Islamic law, women can own property. That was something the Prophet Muhammad innovated. It didn't exist. It didn't exist in Christianity. It didn't exist in Judaism. It didn't exist in the Roman Empire. Women were not allowed to own property. And they were actually the chattel of their father, and then they become the property of the husband. That is not the way in Islam. Remember, the first Muslim was the Prophet's wife, Khadija, who was a successful, rich businesswoman who had been his boss. He was working for her as a merchant, and she had fallen in love with him, and she proposed to him. And he was this poor, the orphan kid who's like, and she was older than him. He's like, he couldn't even believe he was getting his proposal. Sure, I agreed to it. But she was a rich woman. So Islam had started by a wealthy woman of property because of her, right? And she protected him because she had the resources to protect him from his enemies. And so Islam established women could own property. That's incomprehensible until in the West until 1900. Women didn't get the right to own property in America until the 1920s or so. And so that's shocking to us today. But in the Islamic world, women could own property. That changed their practical power, right? And that's probably one of the reasons that many women, like Mother Mara here, probably felt sympathy for the Ottomans and thought, once the Ottomans take Europe, the status of women is going to get better. Right? It's going to get better. They're going to have rights they don't have under this existing system. And so women were like, Islam, bring these guys in. It'll make Christian women's lives easier. Right? So that's hard for us to grasp today with our perception of Islam and women today. But certainly at this period, it's very clear which was the more restrained and limited environment for women. And that was very much Christian Europe. That's just historically true. And so it makes sense that Mara will be like, as a strong woman herself, she's like, if my father's people win, it's all gets rolled backwards. Our property rights go away. Women could testify in court in the Islamic world. You can't testify in court as a woman in the Christian world. All that gets taken away. There's things they didn't talk about in the show, which might explain why would a Christian woman want these guys to win? And there's truth in that. So.
And I want to get back to the blood moon part, mainly because of how important it is in a sense where you had one group, let's say everybody in Constantinople who looked at this moon and looked at it as an omen, while Mehmed's, I guess followers looked at it as a blessing. I think it's very interesting, the interpretation of, let's say natural phenomenon in a culture and what kind of an effect it can have over the outcome of something was something else that I was incredibly fascinated by, because you could see the response of everybody in the city, even if they were winning, if they saw that moon, immediately their tone changed dramatically by seeing that and interpreting it as an omen when let's say to the other party thinks it's a fantastic, most incredible, celebratory, good sign. What do you think about that in regards to such an interesting, natural phenomenon having an effect over the morale and maybe even perhaps, the desire to continue on in this action?
Well, so when you talk about the blood moon, what you're referring to for the audience here is an eclipse, a lunar eclipse. That's when the moon appears to turn red as it disappears behind the Earth's shadow, right? And so in Europe, and this is an ancient superstition going back probably to the Roman era, probably prior to that, the eclipses were seen as some kind of curse from God or the gods, right? The sun, and this is other cultures as well. The sun is being eaten by a dragon kind of thing, right? And and people were in much of we see much of Mesoamerica, eclipses were seen as a negative portent, right? Islam had a different attitude towards it because the Quran talks about solar and lunar and star events, right? Talks about them as signs of God, right? And so I think a pivotal event that happened in Islamic history that made people think of astronomy in a different way than Europe did, and much of the West did, including Mesoamerica, was that there's a tragic event in the Prophet Muhammad's life. After his victory, after he had essentially won and defeated his adversaries and conquered Mecca and established Islam as the religion of Arabia, and having defeated the polytheistic pre-Islamic religion, at the height of his victory, he had an infant son, Ibrahim, who was about 2 years old, who died, just died of illness, young child sickness, and that was a heartbreaking moment for him. And he buried his son. I've actually been to the son's grave. I've been to the Prophet's grave in Medina, and I've been to the son's grave. And there is a story told that at the moment, the morning of his death, when he died, there was a solar eclipse. So we can actually date it. The astronomers can date the moment that his son died, because there was a solar eclipse over that part of Arabia at that time. And so the people in Medina, the city where the Prophet was, came out and said, the heavens, look, this is a negative portent. Even the heavens weep for the death of the Prophet's son. And the Prophet came out, and he had, the account told he had tears streaming from his eyes. But even in the midst of this, he came out and said, The heavens are not eclipsed for any man, including my son. The eclipses are signs of God's power. So remember God when they happen. So they're a sign of God's glory. So that statement altered the Islamic perception of celestial events. So instead of these, oh my God, the moon is being eaten by a dragon, something terrible thing, the Prophet himself says, it does not have this negative meaning of death, because my own son, it had nothing to do with him. But what it is a reminder of God's power over the universe. So remember and praise God when you see it. So it becomes this hopeful thing in the midst of tragedy, which is what happens to Mehmet. He is the tragedy of losing this battle that seems imminent at this point. The eclipse tells him God is in charge and can change events, and that he can transform things. And so a defeat can be transformed into victory. So this event changed Islamic perceptions of things. So yeah, if you see the Ottoman flag, you also see it today in the flag of Turkey, the flag of Pakistan, and other Muslim countries. You'll see the crescent and star, right? So
Yes.
there's a meaning from that. So that is an astronomical event that happened after the Prophet died. When the Muslims conquered the first Byzantine, when they defeated the Byzantines at Yarmouk, which is a river in Palestine, and they defeated, this is just a few years after the Prophet's death, maybe about 4 years later, they defeat the Byzantine army and conquer Palestine and Syria. It just one fell swoop. It was 100-1. They were outnumbered 100-1 and they won. And the leader of that, the governor of Syria, who would become the governor of Syria, Muawiyah, who would become the later caliph, Muawiyah was a young general at the time, and he looked up in the heavens at the battle, and it just so happened there was a rare conjunction of the crescent moon and Venus. And he saw that, using the Prophet's example, that these are not negative portents, they're a sign of God's power. He said, this is our sign that we're going to defeat this 100 times larger army and defeat the Byzantines, who had never been defeated, right? Certainly not by these ragtag guys coming out of the desert, right? And that belief that this constellation, or this conjunction, was a sign from God of victory, gave them the energy to fight, and they won, and they pushed the Byzantines back, beginning the story that would lead to Mehmed's eventual defeat of the Byzantines. So that is an amazing moment in history where the Prophet reframed an event that changed an entire civilization's perception of omen from negative to positive. And that gave Muslims tremendous strength, because there's all kinds of astronomical events happening. And if you see them as a sign of God on your side and not as a sign of God against you, it's a psychological victory. The Byzantines still had the idea that God was against them, so they surrendered to it. They gave up.
Yeah, it's really interesting when looking at that, Kamran, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And there is one more, and I'm not even quite sure what this event was, but maybe you could explain it. All of a sudden, during the fighting, there was another event, and it is featured in this particular series, and it has to do with the Hagia Sophia. There seemed to be some kind of emanating light coming from it. I'm not even quite sure what this was. They don't necessarily describe what had happened.
Yeah, I don't think the historians know what it was. It's just recounted in the event. So something happened. It seems to be some kind of, the way they show it in the show is like a lightning storm that creates sort of a effect of almost like a rising white light rising, or mist rising off the dome of the Hagia Sophia, right? And I will look it up, because I've got this book on the battle. I'm sure nobody knows what that event was. It was mysterious and mystical. The Byzantines interpreted that as it looked to them, the glowing pillar that rose from the dome to the heavens, to them looked like the Virgin Mary leaving the dome. And they had long perceived that the Virgin Mary, because if you go there, the highest icon that's still present today, near the apex of the dome, is this beautiful Virgin Mary holding a baby, right? Stunning, right? And she was considered the protector. Sophia represents divine wisdom, so it's the divine feminine, right, in Greek. And so it was supposed to be protected by the Virgin Mary, and so they perceived that as the Virgin Mary abandoning them, right? I don't know what that event was, and maybe it isn't a scientific event. Maybe it is a mystical event. It's interesting because Marian apparitions have existed throughout history in not just Christian countries, in Muslim countries. One of the most recent Marian flaps that happened was in the 1980s in Cairo in Egypt, where people in both Coptic Christian churches and in mosques were seeing the Virgin Mary appear as an apparition. And each time I was like, no, she didn't appear in your church. She didn't appear in my mosque. She wouldn't appear to your religion, but she was appearing in the holy sites of both of these religions at a time when there was a lot of tension between these two communities in Egypt. and that tension kind of calmed everybody down because Virgin Mary was calming it, right? And so as a Muslim myself, as a Sufi mystic, there may very well have been an image from the Virgin. She's played historical role. We've got the Virgin of Guadalupe,
Yes.
whose vision eventually caused the indigenous people to decide, maybe fighting isn't the best. We're not going to defeat these Spaniards. Maybe working, sort of keeping our traditions alive and hidden in their culture is the only way we're going to survive. And that's how a lot of people interpret that vision, that you fighting them is just going to be annihilated, but you can survive if you trust me. And that's what happened. And there, one more event I'll give of an incredible marrying. We've all heard of the secret of Fatima,
Yes.
the three children who saw
Mhm.
a being they believed to be the Virgin Mary in this Portuguese town of Fatima on the hill, and that's very sacred to Catholics today. So here's an interesting thing. A Sufi master, a Turkish Sufi master, told this to me 20 years ago. He said, people don't understand. Why is that town called Fatima? Fatima is a Muslim name, right?
Yes.
Fatima is the name of the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, who is seen as the divine feminine, the energy through which the feminine energy. She is the mother of the great Sufi saints, the Imams, who are the Prophet's descendants, right? She's the mother, the matrilineal energy of mysticism. And so he said the reason that town is called Fatima is that on that hill, because the Moors, the Muslims, ruled what is now Portugal for several hundred years, right? And that town was named by Moors because on that hill, people were seeing a holy woman, an apparition of a holy woman for centuries. And of course, the Muslims are going to interpret that to be Fatima, the daughter. She's seeing a glowing woman in light. Fatima is called Az-Zahra because whenever people see visions of her, she's surrounded in this brilliant halo of light. And so people are seeing this brilliant halo of light woman. A Catholic is going to interpret that because interesting, the children never said it was the Virgin Mary. That was the interpretation of the people. They said this holy woman that's glowing in light. They never called her the Virgin Mary. They just called her the Holy Woman, right? Our mother, right? They didn't say it. The people, because they're Catholic, that's what they're going to assume it is. The Muslims see a holy woman, they're going to assume it's Fatima. So that site seems to have a spiritual significance for the divine feminine, where people are seeing a holy woman in glowing light throughout centuries of different religions, right? So the event at the IOC may very well have been a moment where, like the Virgin of Guadalupe, where the Virgin Mary did appear and said to these people, stop fighting. It's over. If you keep fighting, you're just going to die. If you surrender, you're going to be okay, because Christianity still exists in Turkey today. The Orthodox Church is still there. The Orthodox Patriarchate is still there. There's beautiful churches in use today in Turkey. There are beautiful synagogues. I visited a beautiful synagogue in Istanbul, which is in use today. They're not expelled and killed and persecuted. So the Virgin Mary may have appeared and said, just stop. It's over. Stop fighting. Let God guide this next phase of history, and you will be protected, which they ended up being.
Yeah, Cameron, I loved what they did with that event in this series. As
Mhm.
I said, they didn't explain what it was, but it was so beautifully done. They made it look like a miracle, Cameron.
Mhm.
If you can describe what a miracle should look like, it
It
did
didn't look natural even in the show. It looked supernatural.
it looked supernatural. It wasn't completely over the top, but you couldn't take your eyes off of it. So it was done just right, Cameron. I think that they got their point across.
Mhm.
I think, I could even go so far as to say that, they were acknowledging, in a sense that something occurred, but also, this was an incredible time in history. And this was just one of the many things that I think anybody who was living at that time witnessed,
Mhm.
that they will never, ever forget. I managed to find one photo. This is not from the story, from the
Mhm.
show.
Yeah.
It's from antiquity.
Mhm.
I'm sure for several reasons they didn't have a picture of what was going on. But even now, I understand what this photo is doing, Cameron.
Mhm.
I understand what this is referring to because of this incredible documentary drama from Netflix. Cameron, what are your final thoughts about season one? Because as you guys, we're going to be doing season two next week. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking about the overall series and so far? And what would you like people to know, or any of your final thoughts on it, Cameron?
Well, my final thoughts, I think everyone should check it out. It's my sister and her husband were like, I don't know if we'll be interested in it. And then they watched it with me last night, and they're like, oh, we're gonna watch the next episode, right? They were blown away. And this is very high quality. It's high quality entertainment. It's high quality scholarship. You've got some very interesting professors giving insights that will help you understand what is happening. The acting is superb. The production design is superb. I've had my producing partners on my project. I've told them you have to watch a show that will help us with costume design, and we have to look at some of these actors for casting. I'm already thinking in those practical terms. But I think just as a viewer, it's an incredibly rich story, and it is an emotional story. Whichever side you identify with, there's no judgment here. These are both people that believe that they are right and that God is on their side. And and even in defeat, they don't. The Byzantines don't lose their faith that God is with them. They just accept this historical moment in the same way that Palestinians are facing. They lost control of their area, right? And so they have to come to terms with that. But does that mean God is against you? It just means it's a historical moment, right? And so watch it, because I think you will learn more than you imagine, and the acting is incredible, and Tuba Boyokistan, one of the best actors I've ever seen. So hopefully I can work with her in the future.
Well, that's exciting to hear, Cameron. First of all, and I didn't talk too much about this, but I fell in love with the costumes in this series. I think they were stunningly beautiful. As I said, this series does not feel as if it was from the ancient, 500 years ago. It feels like it happened yesterday. And Cameron, there were a lot of times that I was rooting for both sides. Where they showed you a scene and you were in Constantinople and something happened and they're like, yeah, we've got to do something. I'm like, yeah, you guys got to do something. We got to do something. And then I find myself, on the Sultan side. I think it's very interesting that a story called, Rise of Empires Ottoman had you kind of teetering on both. It's very clever approach to that. I think that the scholars who they decided to bring in are very passionate about their disciplines. They were thrilled to be part of this, show, going into the second season. We had maybe some of the best battle scenes I've seen for a docudrama, Cameron.
I've seen some of the best battle scenes we've seen in historical movies, period.
Yes. I was so impressed by what I was seeing, and they didn't leave anything to chance. They followed through on a lot of the scenes where they would start with action. You would see the troops go in. You would see they had an intention, meaning that they would follow one or two people to fruition. You just didn't see like a whole mass of people. It wasn't like that. You were brought into very close to the scenes. We saw armor and weapons very close up. We understood what that meant. And the difference in, yes, there was chainmail. Yes, there was all different types of things like that, but also the beautiful clothing that the women were wearing. It was just absolutely stunning, Cameron. And, I think that this change that we saw in this particular, let's say leadership was exciting at the end because, all of a sudden Mehmed had attain this goal, and it felt like it almost like a renaissance in a way.
And that's what the last words of the show, I will reveal them, or let's begin, right? And so it's the beginning of this 600-year empire that's going to rule half the planet, right, and change the world. It doesn't get defeated until World War I.
Well, Cameron, anytime a series can make you this excited to see the next group of shows or even the next episodes, it's remarkable. Now, this series also does cover the Roman Empire as well. And Cameron, you and I have watched that, and it is spectacular what they've done in sort of setting the record straight with a lot of these Roman leaders. And of course, Constantinople was the last one, let's say, but Constantine the 11th. But Cameron, I can't say enough about this show. There's so much in it. It really is maybe the best series out right now historically.
I agree.
Until
hopefully my show gets on the air, and then we can have that conversation as whether I beat them or not. They've set a very high bar.
Well, I encourage anybody who loves history and also loves a wonderful story. There is love in this story. There's mysticism. There's beauty in this. This is an amazing thing, but there's also a lot of battle scenes. There's a lot of death. There's action. There's so much in this. It really is a full story. And, one of the most important battle scenes, or maybe two or three of them, there's probably more, Cameron, if we went through the whole thing, some of the most amazing battle scenes. I'm sure some of you out there who are in the military have read books and studied some of that stuff, but I've never seen that before. So I was very impressed to even see that that picture I showed you, Cameron, where they showed you the boats kind of going over, and just really seeing how incredible that must have been. Can you imagine, Cameron? And this is maybe the last thing I'm going to say. If you were, they couldn't see it because the mountain was blocking the view from the Ottomans couldn't see it. Excuse me. Everybody in Constantinople couldn't see it because there was a mountain blocking the view. But if you were on the other side, can you imagine your eyes when you saw that ship go down the side of the mountain and go into the water? Just think about what it would mean at that time, Cameron. The awe and seeing the men physically.
It's like Luke Skywalker dropping the proton torpedo into the into the little hole, right? It's impossible. And when you see that, and they do show the reactions to people when they wake up and they look out the windows, and there's Ottoman ships in this area that no ship has ever entered for 1,000 years. No enemy ship has ever entered. That sense of we've been defeated. I mean, it's magic. It's pure magic. How do they do this, right? It's like transported by the teleporter from Enterprise. It's not possible. And that's the turning point of this thing. So I do actually need to step away and take care of some stuff. So I hope this is of value to our audience.
Yes, it is. And Cameron, I am wrapping up the show. I'm just looking for your where it says to follow Cameron on his Patreon. Guys, follow Cameron on his Patreon. Certainly do join it. I'm a member of Cameron's Patreon. Everybody, Cameron is an incredible author. And you have to go on his Patreon. He talks about the Pasha method. If you want to learn how to write and become a great screenplay writer, a great story writer, this is the place where you need to go. He showed you everything. He's incredibly generous, even makes time for the members. So please do look up Cameron's information on his Patreon. Cameron, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I so appreciate you've made this such an enriching and wonderful discussion tonight. I've been dying to talk to you about this series. And guys, next week, we're going to do it all over again, but for season 2, Vlad versus Mehmed.
Which is great too, but it's different. It's a different show, and it's also very intriguing.
It is very intriguing. Cameron, this entire series is intriguing. Guys, please subscribe to my channel if you enjoy programming like this. I assure you.
Everyone hit the like button, share this out there. I think this was a great discussion, and it's a show unlike anything that's on television today. And I think let people know about it. Watch it yourselves. I think you'll get hooked in the first episode, like my reluctant sister and brother-in-law were. They were hooked in the first episode.
It is infectious. Thank you everybody for watching. Thank you, Cameron, for joining. Guys, right in about an hour, at maybe in a half an hour, I'm going to be starting my live Golden Globes watch party with Lorena and the Cinemike here on Positive Fandom. So for those of you who want to watch the Golden Globes and we just kind of enjoy everything, please do come back a little bit later. But Cameron, thank you so much for everything. And Tom Jr. Jackson, my moderator, collaborator, we are all good people. Thank you so much for your support, guys, and subscribe to his channel as well. Yeah. And I just want to say for everybody out there, no matter where you are, always do remember to please be kind. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and take care. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.